Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren McKenna, Chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association. So happy that you're with us today. We have a wonderful number of people participating in today's program, and we're so glad you could join us. With the end of COVID-19 in sight, many of us are reflecting on what we've learned from the past year and a half. And this period of disruption has shed a light on the challenges that have already existed within our legal community, including those related to work-life balance and to diversity issues. But it's also provided us with a unique opportunity to think about where we've been and what the future looks like ahead. One of the best resources I read on this topic is a new American Bar Association report entitled Practicing Law in the Pandemic and Moving Forward, Results and Best Practices from a nationwide survey of the legal profession. And that study is based on one of the largest ever surveys of ABA members, and it deals with the way the pandemic has affected lawyers and what that means for all of us in the legal profession, particularly women lawyers and lawyers of color. Joining us today to present their findings on this report are co-authors Bobby Liebenberg. Bobby is a senior partner at Fine Kaplan and Black here in Philadelphia and a longtime member and friend of our association. Her co-author, Stephanie Scharf, is a founding member at Scharf Banks Memore LLC. We're also happy to welcome two leaders from our legal community who will talk with Bobby and Stephanie about best practices as individual attorneys and firms prepare to emerge from this period of major disruption. We welcome Joanne Epps, Executive Vice President and Provost and a Professor of Law at Temple University, and Karen Pollack, Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Transamerica. I'm now pleased to introduce the moderator for our discussion today, Jen Coatsworth, a partner at Margolis Edelstein and an officer of our great association. Jen will talk more about the format for today's program and about Bobby and Stephanie's extensive research on this important work for our profession. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to a robust discussion today. Jen?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chancellor McKenna, and thank you to the Philadelphia Bar Association for bringing this program forward today. Practicing law in the pandemic and moving forward is the latest in a series of studies that were authored by these two trailblazing attorneys, Bobby Liebenberg and Stephanie Scharf. I'm very proud to say that the Philadelphia Bar Association has always played a role in promoting their work, recognizing its importance to our profession. The first groundbreaking study, published in 2015, focused on women as first chair or lead counsel for civil and criminal trials. It analyzed characteristics of cases, law firms, and clients that impact the extent to which men and women serve in lead counsel roles. When I served as the Women in the Profession co-chair with the late, great Amber Racine, one of the first programs we planned was a Chancellor's Forum CLE, focusing on this report. It featured a practical discussion with several prominent lawyers and judges who explored remedies to the problem of the dearth of women as lead counsel and practical solutions for moving forward, as well as the causes for the phenomenon. In 2019, Bobby and Stephanie published the findings of their second study, Walking Out the Door, which focused on the troublesome high rates of senior women lawyers leaving the profession prematurely, particularly from big law. The study examined what factors led experienced women to leave at such a higher rate than their male counterparts. Once again, our Bar Association hosted a program featuring this study prominently. Now we have our third insightful volume to digest, building on the findings of their previous studies and focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on women in the profession. The study examines how gender roles have reverted back to 1960s norms, where women are expected to shoulder increased burdens of household duties while billing or working the same number of hours or workload. This is unsustainable, and we must look for solutions to alleviate the burden. That will be the focus of our panel discussion once we hear from our two experts, Bobby and Stephanie, about their conclusions. I will now turn the program over to them to discuss their findings, and will join you in a little while to continue the panel discussion.
Thank you. And thank you to the Philadelphia Bar Association and to Chancellor McKenna for your wonderful introduction, and Jen for your wonderful introduction as well. We are extremely excited to be here. As a result of the pandemic, the legal profession has gone through a seismic change, and the practice of law is very different today than it was in March 2020 when the national shutdown orders were put into place. The Red B Group, which Stephanie and I are principals of, worked with the ABA to conduct one of the largest national surveys of ABA members. The objective of the survey was to understand how the pandemic was impacting the legal profession, how lawyers expected the practice of law to evolve in the future, and importantly, as we navigated into moving from remote work, what were the types of resources that lawyers would need? The report, which is free to be downloaded off the ABA website, contains not only our really eye-opening findings, which we're going to discuss, but also data-based best practices, recommended best practices, not only for legal organizations, but for individual employers as well. The Practice Forward report provides a framework for all legal organizations to think about refocusing and revamping how they want the culture of their organizations to play in the next normal, and how they can approach hiring, retention, advancement, and of course, diversity and equity policies and initiatives. Stephanie?
Thank you very much, Bobby. I'm delighted to be here with everyone today. Can we turn to the next slide, please? And Bobby just mentioned the challenges that drove the research. Next slide, please. And here is, just for those who are interested in reading it, a copy of the survey report which we wrote, which covers many, many different practice areas, settings, ages, all sorts of types of lawyers. And the report is free online. As you can see here, all you have to do is Google practicing law in the pandemic at the americanbar.com website, and you'll be able to get a copy. So let's jump into it. And go slide, please. This is aptly entitled "One Picture is Worth 1,000 Words." I dare say that 2 years ago, 90% of the people on this call would have looked at this picture and said, what is that? Is that a bunch of people in some kind of narrow area of the tech industry, and that's how they get together? I don't think many of us would have recognized this for what it is, which is, of course, a Zoom picture. And in the last year and a half, most of us have spent hours and hours on Zoom or Teams or WebEx, because that is now how we interact with each other, just as we are today. It's how we speak to our colleagues. It's how we speak to opposing counsel. It's how we present ourselves in court. It's how we stay connected. Zoom has made it possible for us to work remotely, but it is certainly not, as we learned over the months, not a panacea. While Zoom helps people to work remotely, there are downsides, and how firms and corporations manage those downsides will shape a lot about how people feel about practicing law, how they feel about staying in their firm or workplace, how lawyers learn, and also how it's managed will go back to and determine whether we can again have the personal relationships we had with our partners and our teams and our clients, and the nature of those relationships. So let's turn now to some key areas where lawyers say, based on our survey, where lawyers say help is needed as we emerge from the pandemic. Bobby, I'm turning it back to you.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So an unexpected finding of our study was that legal employers did not reduce or adjust billable hour requirements during the pandemic. And as a result, all lawyers felt pressure of their work. Many lawyers were working what seemed to be 24/7. They did not take days off. They didn't take vacations. The lines blurred between work days and weeknights and weekends. And this pressure, as you can see from the slide, exacerbated stress, anxiety, depression, and even burnout for all lawyers. However, stress and anxiety rose to even higher levels for women with children and lawyers of color. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that the stress and anxiety that lawyers felt was something that was very commonplace pre-pandemic. But as a result of the pandemic, women lawyers, especially those with children, reported that their work was disrupted more often by family and household obligations than pre-pandemic. In fact, you can see 63% of women lawyers said it was harder to keep their home and work lives separate. 60% felt overwhelmed with all the things they had to do. And 52% of women lawyers were experiencing stress at work. And this stress resulted in a finding that women lawyers were more worried than men about their advancement, their compensation, and whether they would be furloughed or even laid off. And if you, women lawyers with children, and then we'll go to the next slide, more often felt that they were being overlooked for assignments or client opportunities, and they were being viewed as not sufficiently committed to their firm or employer. Now, we talked a little bit about the walking out the door study, and in that study, which looked at the high rate of attrition of experienced women lawyers, women lawyers have been practicing 15 plus years, we found that 63% of experienced women lawyers pre-pandemic reported that they were perceived as not sufficiently committed to their careers, as compared to just 2% of men. And these misperceptions about a lack of commitment, dedication, or ambition for women lawyers only increased during the pandemic. So given this data, it was not surprising that 53% of women with children ages 5 or younger and 41% of women with children ages 6 to 13 were considering working part-time. 43% reported that it was extremely important or very important that their employers offered part-time work. And what was very interesting is that our statistics are very consistent with a 2020 McKinsey Lean In Women in the Workplace study that found that 1 in 4 women were considering either downsizing their career or leaving the workforce altogether. So our study finds that women lawyers were anxious that their careers would be defined and perhaps even harmed by their performance during the pandemic. Next slide, please.
So one of the things we were curious about is how firms and corporations addressed their DE&I strategies during the pandemic. I mean, 2020 was not only the year of the pandemic, but it was the year that the COVID hit us, but it was also a time where Black Lives Matter took on great force and the country as a whole reacted to the George Floyd death. And we found that over the last year, the majority of lawyers were in workplaces where strategies around racial and ethnic diversity continued to function, Although a substantial number of lawyers, a little bit to our surprise, sometimes up to as much as 1/3, said that their DE&I strategies were put on hold or were not in place at all. And that was also true for strategies around gender diversity. And you can see examples of strategies that people kept going: unconscious bias training, mentorship and sponsorship programs, a strategy to increase the number of partners, to increase the number of lawyers of color or women in leadership, a strategy for introducing lawyers to clients and assigning lawyers to significant matters where they can get the attention of clients and include lawyers in business opportunities. But one thing that we also were interested in is, are firms and corporations using accountability tools to see how these strategies are working? And we found, to our surprise, that over 2/3 of firms and companies don't use any accountability tools in order to determine, are strategies doing what the firms want them to do? And even those third or so that do use accountability tools, not all of them by any means use metrics to assess change. And our view is that in order to know how any initiative is actually working, you must have some kind of metrics and some kind of accountability tools based on metrics. And those tools and the existence of them say a lot about a company's or a firm's actual commitment to change. Bobby, I think you're taking the next slide.
Yes, please. You could advance the slide. Yeah, so as Stephanie explained, given the refocus and reemphasis on DEI issues and a refocus on racial and social justice issues, we wanted to ask a series of questions with respect to whether lawyers of color felt stress at work simply on account of their race or ethnicity. And this slide shows that 47% of lawyers of color feel stressed at work very often, almost all the time, on account of their race or ethnicity, compared to just 7% of white lawyers. 54% of women of color responded, so higher than just the overall lawyers of color, experienced stress at work because of their race or ethnicity, compared to 6% of white women and 41% of men of color. And this intersection of race and ethnicity and gender is obviously heightening stress for women attorneys of color. It is interesting that last week an ALM study likewise found findings very consistent with our Practice Forward survey. They reported that lawyers of color were experiencing higher levels of suicidal thoughts, depression, and isolation compared to their white colleagues, and almost half of attorneys of color reported feeling less supported by their law firms. If we can go to the next slide. And again, when we looked at the frequency of stress at work on account of gender, we also found that 52% of women were experiencing stress solely on account of their gender. And these findings are extremely sobering and should be raising alarm bells for all legal employers, because it could portend a future talent exodus with a disproportionate impact on women and lawyers of color. And of course, this is coming at the exact same time that clients are demanding that women and diverse lawyers handle their matters, and not just at the associate level. Many corporate clients want to see experienced lawyers of color and women become equity partners, serve as first chairs at trial and leads on deals, and included as part of succession planning to become client relationship partners and receive equitable allocation and of allocations of origination credit. And what this means is that legal employers must remain laser focused on the strategies necessary to develop a diverse group of lawyers, and in particular, to ensure a culture and policies to retain and promote them so that we have a pipeline of women and lawyers of color. Next slide, Stephanie.
One big benefit of the Moving Forward survey in the report is that it allows all members of the legal profession to see what it is that a wide range of lawyers would like their employers to provide as we move past the pandemic. And three things, we're going to focus on three things today. One is remote working and how it will work. Second is lawyer well-being, and a third is workplace culture. So let me say that we asked lawyers, what would you like to do going forward with respect to remote working? And over 1/3 of lawyers said that they want full, complete autonomy to choose every week whether they come to work or not. They want what is truly full flex time. And then the remaining 2/3 of lawyers spread out, probably not surprising me, over the day of the week. Some lawyers want to be in the office rarely or one day a week. Some lawyers want to be in 2 or 3 days a week, and some lawyers would like to be in the office 4 to 5 days a week. And those results really beg the question. And if we can have the next slide, please. What resources do lawyers say they need for remote working? And there is a list here, but it's the top 5 that really struck us, because at least 2/3 of lawyers would like these resources: excellent access to office online files, office quality internet, strong IT support, excellent access to help from support staff, and home equipment paralleling office equipment. And I'm sure, both based on all of our individual experiences, these aspects of what you would like your employer to provide really speak to many of us. If firms and companies begin to address those factors, it's certainly not too soon to start. Bobby, you want to talk about the next topic?
Yes, please. Next slide, please. So the type of support the lawyers are asking for are really around mental and physical wellness and family resources. So an important finding of the survey was that 67% of women believe that it was very or extremely important for employers to offer comprehensive plans for sick and family leave, including adding more days for personal time off and adding more months of paid parental leave that can be taken to cover childcare gaps. 81% of women respondents with young children wanted better resources for working parents. And 44% of women wanted their legal organizations to provide more wellness resources. And given what we're seeing with this increased level of anxiety and depression and even burnout, this is going to become very important going forward, and destigmatizing talking about these issues is going to become extremely important as well. Next slide.
So this next slide comes back again to the topic because it turned out to be so much on lawyers' minds, really all over the country. And that is, what kind of support are they getting from their firms? Are they getting the respect and the attention and the time and the sense of belonging that we probably pretty much took for granted pre-pandemic, when we were all working together and saw people on a daily basis? But what our survey showed was the feeling of being on your own has been greatly exacerbated. There are ways, of course, to overcome that. There are ways for firm leaders to close that gap and provide the feeling of people being engaged and productive and working together. These are some of the ways that our survey respondents thought were extremely important. You know, what we'd like to do at this point is end up with a set of best practices that we developed based on the very large amount of data that we got from the survey, which was representative of the entire American Bar Association. If you could turn to the next slide, please. I think it's no exaggeration to say that at this time we are all standing on the cusp of a post-pandemic era. And we're really looking forward in the way of we're not quite sure about what the practice of law will look like. And we firmly believe that leaders shape the culture of their organizations. And with all that is facing the profession, we think now is the time for leaders to pause and rethink about their organization structure and policy and practices. And there are certain core questions that organizations have to grapple with. One is, it's a question that we all typically asked in the past, but it takes on even more urgency now. What do we want to look like 2, 3, and 5 years from now? How will we get there? Can we provide the type of culture that attracts and retains the lawyers we want to attract and retain? And can we create cultures that keep a wide range of lawyers at all levels productive and engaged? And these are not easy questions for people to ask. We know that they're tough questions, and they will undoubtedly elicit a very wide range of responses. But if you have an organization with leaders that will reach out and listen to people at all levels and act on what they hear, your firm, your corporate law department, your organization will be greatly advantaged by fostering a more productive and collegial workplace.
And Stephanie, given our time, I think what we'll do with the rest of these best practices is incorporate them. And Tracy, if you could show the next to last slide. The last slide, yeah. We're gonna hopefully with Jen's great moderation, we'll incorporate a lot of these best practices as we engage in the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Bobby and Stephanie. And now we're going to bring the rest of our esteemed panel into the discussion. And I will let our participants know that if you have questions that you would like to hear input from the panel, you can put those questions in the chat. And we're going to be monitoring the chat and asking those questions as we go through. However, we do have some topics that we've prepared in advance. So I'm going to first ask Stephanie and Bobby to sort of expand upon some of their discussion on just talk a little bit about how the results of this study confirmed the previous work that you've done in this area, or how did it contradict it? How did it run counter to what you've previously seen?
Well, let me begin and say this. We previously saw that even experienced women lawyers dropped out of practicing law far before their careers were over. And the two top reasons they did that was because of the pressure of dealing with childcare and the stress it took to pull it all together. And I think it's fair to say that any organization today that doesn't have ways to retain and advance women lawyers is really going to fall behind. You know, for decades now, 50% of people graduating from law school have been women. And the same, by the way, is going to be true and probably is true today regarding lawyers of color. 1/3 of law school classes are lawyers of color. So I would say the pandemic has really exacerbated what the issues are for women in particular, and for lawyers of color. And It's not that this is new, it's that it really, really became intense. And now is the time that it really, really has to be dealt with.
So Jen, two observations. Going back to that great slide about Zoom pictures. We know that pre-pandemic, women often had trouble getting seats at the actual table, right? But we have seen, and our research showed, that both women and lawyers of color also had trouble during the pandemic getting seats at the virtual table, and that the data showed that they were having great difficulty in being heard in Zoom meetings or in types of these informal types of other types of platforms where people were connecting. And our findings again were substantiated by a Catalyst study where 45% of women said that they were also being overlooked at in virtual meetings. So a lot of the same problems that existed pre-pandemic were, like on steroids during the pandemic. And the other thing I would say is that we know from the transition to remote work that it was effective, that law firms had banner years in terms of revenue. And what will happen, and I know we're going to discuss this, about remote work going forward. Pre-pandemic, flex time and part-time was mostly used by women, and it had been stigmatized really as being the mommy track. And what will happen now as we come back out of the pandemic, where we know that lawyers, and especially younger lawyers, are going to be demanding remote work? Is there going to be a gender divide where men come back into the office, but women elect to try and continue to work remotely? These are the kinds of issues that Stephanie and I, as research, are going to continue to study.
Thank you. Now I want to turn to Provost Epps and to Karen to see what kinds of resources the legal profession can provide to address these issues that Bobby and Stephanie discussed, particularly from the standpoint of educational institutions, individual employers, and even we in bar associations. How can we, what resources can we provide that will help address these concerns?
Karen, you can start.
Thanks, Joanne. I think one thing that's particularly valuable and that we as lawyers ought to be able to deliver on is policy advocacy. And so not just internally in our own employment frameworks, whether you're in a university or in a company or in a law firm, and helping your employer to do better from a policy standpoint in terms of childcare, family leave, and other safety net type supports to help people to manage going forward. I think advocating at the federal and state level and the municipal level to help us get to a better place on those fronts will make a difference overall.
I would agree and add just a slightly different perspective from the viewpoint of an academic institution. When I think about when I grew up, I didn't even know what to ask for. So you sort of were in this world and it was the way it was. And you grew up and realized, I should have been asking for that sooner. So one of the things that I think goes with Karen's point about policy advocacy is awareness to young students and lawyers about what they should be expecting. Because I think we are in a world, sadly, tragically, of a lot of retrenchment on this and many issues. And I think to the extent that these young people could say, this is what I expect of the employer that I have, will really help if they find their voice collectively. Because I will use this as an example. When I grew up, the guys went off and played golf and the women sat behind, and we didn't even really think much about it because we didn't play golf and we didn't realize what it meant to be excluded. And then there was that moment of recognition where you realize not just the sport, but the access. And so it's that kind of awareness that I think is going to be really important for the profession and for educational institutions to share with the young people, both men and women coming forward, as to what the right mentorship needs to be in order to keep all of the talented people part of the profession.
And I'll even add to that, Joanne. I think it's such an excellent point, and it's a piece of advice that I give people all the time. You never know unless you ask, right? So if you're having trouble managing XYZ, if you don't raise your hand and say so, most people are not going to be able to read your mind and know that. Well, none of us know quite what the future is going to look like, and all of us are trying to figure out where's the best place to land. What should it look like, or what do we want it to look like? And so this is the perfect time to be raising your hand and asking those kinds of questions and saying, you know what, this is the thing that's been hardest for me, or this thing really works for me. I wonder if it will work for other people. So not in a banging down the door kind of way, but in a very productive and helpful way. I think asking for what you need will help us all get to a better place.
I couldn't agree more.
I absolutely agree. And just to put another fine point on that, I think legal employers need to reach out and really ask, what do people need, right? It's not just on the individual lawyer to ask, but we have seen from our prior research that there is always a disconnect between what law firm managing partners think, how they're doing with respect to gender diversity and moving programs and initiatives forward, and how actually women and lawyers of color think they're doing. And so really getting the perspective of what are the resources that we need. If we work remotely, what is the type of development and mentoring and evaluation processes that need to be in place so that when you're out of sight, out of mind, because you're working remotely, that you still get access to client opportunities and working on important matters. And these are the kinds of really holistic approaches I think we need to be thinking about.
Can I add one thing? One of the things that I believe drives a lot of behavior, and I'll just put it in the first person because I don't want to speak for any of the rest of you. We're all trying to figure out how we rate in the rankings organization. And there's a difference between rankings and rating. But one of the things that I think we have to really collectively think about is how to take some of the emphasis away from revenue, because that's one of the things that really is driving a lot of these decisions. And, and that we can do without violating the antitrust laws, I think. Collectively to push back, to talk about what really matters, because I understand from the perspective of the managing partners, they're trying to do the things that they believe they've been tasked to do, which is make it onto certain rankings organizations. And it's got consequences. And so I think collectively, as we find our awareness and our voice, we can push back against the things that are really having a pernicious effect on women and people of color in particular.
And one of our recommended best practices, Joanne.
And I think one of the ways—
Where's the report? I didn't remember that, so I apologize. Maybe that's where I got that. Maybe that's where I got that idea. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Bobby.
Well, and one of the ways we can do just that, I think, is to maybe come up with some alternative billable structures. So, what are some of those ways to face those challenges, particularly for women and minorities, to address the really rigorous billable hour structures that so many, standard law firms have? And from Karen's perspective, how can in-house counsel and private employers address those issues and help with the firm structures?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because because first of all, I'm a strong believer in alternative fees. But I want to be clear about why alternative fees are appropriate, or why thinking about things in structures outside the billable hours structure are important. For us, first, absolutely, it's predictability and risk sharing. That's absolutely true. And we have budgets to manage and everything else. But the point of getting away from the billable hour is in large part because the billable hour is not an efficient way to judge sort of productivity and performance. So there must be other ways for law firms to determine productivity and performance, aside from the number of hours that you've worked in a year, or the number of hours actually that you've been able to bill in a year, because we all know that that's those two are different, right? The number of hours that you actually worked and the number of hours that you could bill. So my ask for law firms is to say, we're supposed to be wise legal and business partners and strategists, all of us, whether you're in-house or in a law firm. And so let's put our mind to other ways to manage productivity and performance aside from the billable hour. And then perhaps we can take away some of those stresses that impact women and sometimes people of color in a very different way, or in an even more challenging way when we think about all of the other hours that we're spending doing other things.
Excellent. And Bobby or Stephanie, did your research provide any of these alternative methods that might be helpful?
Yes, one of our recommended best practices is to really think about revamping compensation systems and really think about rewarding the type of conduct you really want to see. So rewarding collaboration and teamwork. We know in the pandemic that teams were vital to ensuring how matters were handled. Teams from all over got together, and we should be rewarding collaboration and teamwork and promoting efficiency as opposed to just rote billable hours. In addition, law firms say that they often compensate for good citizenship, but in other research that we have done, looking at the factors that go into compensation, there's really three things: origination credit, billable hours, and revenue collected. And while, there's sort of a lot of talk, that we think mentoring and cross marketing and all of that is important, it actually is not rewarded. So if law firms want to promote this type of conduct, then they have to reward for it. They should be rewarding team managers and team leaders and managers as to how well they advance women and lawyers of color in their teams. If there was compensation tied to those types of results, I think you would see more investment in making sure that team members are advancing, making sure that that lawyers, especially as they are starting to retire, how do you help transition senior partners to ensure that clients, that women and lawyers of color are in the lines of succession to inherit clients? We know that in the next 10 years, 400,000 baby boomers allegedly are set to retire if they ever will. And so if you could ensure this transition for women and lawyers of color, you could create an entire new generation of rainmakers.
And that I just want to re-emphasize Joanne's excellent point about metrics, because we're going to talk a lot about metrics. I think one of the great things that came out of the report is that metrics really truly matter. And so to Joanne's point about the way in which law firms are measured, law firms themselves are ranked on the basis of not just the billable hour, but the revenue dollars, right? Revenues per partner. If we ask NELP and others to change the way in which we measure law firms, if we ask them to measure law firms, or law firms ask them to measure themselves in ways that really matter for these kinds of results, for the results that we think we need to see, as opposed to things that we think aren't as telling, then perhaps we'll get to a better place, or at least that will help us get there.
Erin, thank you for that point. I really appreciate it. And I do appreciate that, because we count what matters. And that's the reality. And so your point is very well taken. And I think we have to ask ourselves as a profession why this matters. And I believe that Cheryl Axelrod is one of the many people on this gathering, because she was one of the first people that I remember did a program on the business case for diversity. She wasn't the only person, but she was one of the people I associate with getting there early. And so the reality is, we're not just talking about what should feel good. This really has to matter. If you think about the kinds of things that expose you to new clients, new opportunities, new viewpoints, new perspectives, new theories of a case, new ways to appeal to a jury, If none of that matters, then this conversation doesn't matter, but we know it matters very much. And so part of what we need to do is figure out the way to explain to people there really is more to value than what they narrowly think right now. So Karen, thank you very much for that point. And I think we collectively just have to use our voices to help illuminate that point, because it's not like it's not real. It really is. We just have to shine a light on it.
I agree. And I think, it's not a new point, as you pointed out, Provost Epps. I mean, this is the business case for diversity here. And this is something that we've been talking about. I remember that this was a topic that was addressed in the first Chancellor's CLE that we did for Bobby and Stephanie's first study that we talked about in the beginning of the program. It's got to be driven, I think, from the clients. And so that's where Karen's perspective is so important to hear, from the business side of things, why and how we can institute these changes. And I think that's really what's going to drive law firms and other organizations to make these changes that we're talking about. So I think most of us would agree that the last 15 to 18 months have exacerbated problems that have already existed for lawyers and the U.S. workforce and society as a whole, about how can we be, with stressors of work and life balance, but how can we be more vigilant about recognizing these types of issues, and particularly the issues that led to Bobby and Stephanie's second study about women lawyers leaving the profession? How can we recognize these signs prior to burnout or other, really intense struggling of those in our profession, particularly women of color and women of color in particular, earlier, without needing to have a global pandemic spur any action? So I'll open that up, I guess, maybe to Stephanie and Bobby, and then hear from Provost Epps and Karen.
So, it's not that hard to find out what people need. You just ask them and they will tell you. I think that too often leaders speak to other leaders, or people at a certain level of a firm or a company speak to that level very often, and they kind of presume that they know what people need and they know what people want. And one of the things that we found out from our research is that you don't really know unless you ask. And not only that, but asking what people want can be an incredibly energizing and refreshing force, because the value of diversity, and however you define it, but the value of diversity is you hear from people who are not like you, who are different from you, who have different experiences, who have different ideas, and who can really cause you to think and rethink, well, what do we want? What does the firm or what does the company want to accomplish? And if you reach out and get ideas from lots of different people, it'll be refreshing, energizing, and will typically have much better results than if you sort of either push it aside as I'll take care of it next week or next month, or if you only speak to your peers. So I would say it's not that hard, just do it.
I would also advise, check your assumptions. I think a lot of people believe, for example, that younger lawyers are more resilient and really are not as stressed out as the data seems to indicate. So lawyers, in our study, the lawyers that actually were having the hardest time, in addition to women and lawyers of color, were lawyers practicing 10 plus years and senior lawyers. So lawyers that it was much more difficult for them to transition to remote work. They may not have had an office that had the types of technology that they needed to really practice. And so one, check assumptions in terms of who's stressed, who's not stressed. And by the way, it's a continuum. So by the time you get to burnout, it may be too late, because that has real physical symptoms. And burnout is really a demonstration that the workplace is not doing what it needs to do. It's not a personal failing. It means that there's some type of team or leadership problem that is impacting how lawyers are feeling in terms of autonomy and control and resources, and then the physical manifestations. And the one thing I think Stephanie and I are both looking at, and why we think surveying these types of questions about anxiety, stress, and burnout are so important, is that lawyers are going to be leaving mentally before they leave physically. And so you don't know who may be leaving. And the last point I'll say is, for remote work, law firms that do not truly support remote work, I think are going to be at a real recruitment and retention disadvantage.
I love that point, and I would just like to add the following. One of the things that we have to realize is, in this world of social media, in contrast to when I grew up, when reality was intermittently shared, reality is immediately shared today. One of the things we have to worry about is that when this word gets out, women are going to stop applying to law school. That's going to be bad for our society. You know, it's not just going to be bad for employers, it's going to be bad for our society. Because one of the things that I often said to students is, when you get out of law school, you get a license to have a voice on the world in which we live. It's an incredibly powerful and wonderful opportunity. We need all those voices. So, and I don't mean that in any kind of a political standpoint. It's like, I want our profession to be made up of people who are bringing this really diverse, wonderful conversation about the future world. That can't just be the people that are crazy enough to think I'm there, you know, because they don't have any standards. So I think that we have a societal burden in order to make this work for the world we hand off to our children and grandchildren.
Well, and someone made the point to me, which just so very much resonated with me, that the law profession, the legal profession, is the primary feeder to government and other policy leadership across the globe. If you think about it, at almost every level. So I'm not just talking about Congress, I'm not just talking about, you know, state attorneys general, but across sort of political and other leadership, the legal profession is a feeder for that. And so if the legal profession isn't diverse, neither will any of those forums be. So all the more reason, to your point, Joanne, that we absolutely, and to Bobby's point, I mean, we have to not just keep the people that we have, but we've got to find the right ways to go about getting to a much better place going forward and making progress much more quickly.
And
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Karen. No, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I think, you know, Bobby raised the point of checking your assumptions. And one of the greatest things that I learned from a Diversity Lab conversation, I hope you all know about Diversity Lab, was one of the law firms that they were talking to on a particular effort said that one of the things that they were doing to try and mitigate the departures that often happen at mid-year for mid-year associates, right? You come and practice for a few years, maybe you've paid off some of your student loans, maybe you decide that law firms are not for you and you leave, and so there tends to be a gap in the mid-years. And one of the law firms reflected that they had figured out that they should check their assumptions, that they should actually check in with the mid-years well before somebody came to them to tell them that they were leaving, but just check in on a regular basis. And also to do that, particularly with people of color, to go to them on a regular basis or to set them up with pairs, partner and associate pairs, to check in on a regular basis and just say, hey, how are things going? And so we were talking earlier in this conversation about raising your voice and using your voice. They were proactively asking, what's going on for you? What's working? What's not? How can we do better? It seems like you're getting good work. I've seen you do this. You know, do you feel like you're getting the right work? So just to say that checking in, and to Stephanie's point too, right? It's not so hard. Just we would have picked up the phone. Now we pick up the video, but really to reach out and check in on people and make sure that what you're assuming is going on for them is actually reflected in reality. And if it isn't, what do you need to do about that?
Go ahead, Steph.
I'd like to add on to that because I think we're all talking about a common theme here. And that is, it's not only about the money. And I know for a long time, many firms took the view that, okay, we know 80% of our associates leave by year 6. We'll just fill in the ranks. We'll pay them more money. We hire laterally. They'll come because we'll pay them money. But it turns out that times have changed and the culture has changed enough. And especially for millennials and newer lawyers, it's not just all about the money. It just isn't like that. And I think that the firm that decides really early, we want to keep people engaged. We want to show loyalty is a two-way street. We want people to advance. We want them to train. We want to give them opportunities. We want to show they are appreciated. I think the companies and the firms that do that with their junior lawyers will create a culture of inclusion and a culture of engagement that will really serve them over the long run and really develop talent that will be talent that stays in the firm.
And they will actually produce better results because people are engaged and because people do feel committed to, as well as committed to the company. It's something that companies have begun to figure out. I suppose there's many companies that figured it out better than others, but that their employees are their largest asset. And I think often the law firm model can feel like employees are a commodity. You just described exactly that, right? And if we treat employees like people, and if we take the benefit of the pandemic environment and this environment where we actually get to know people as people and their whole selves often, or at least more aspects of their selves than just their professional selves, if we can hold on to that and amplify that by treating everybody as valuable and not just as a commodity, I think we'll get to a better place. And hopefully then that advances diversity and inclusion and so much more.
And so I think, Karen, the point that you're raising is that in some respects, I think there's a dichotomy between the way law firms look at the data and deal with it versus corporate America. And so I think what we're all talking about here are what are the metrics that we're using and how are we measuring the data, and how can organizations, be they legal departments or law firms, use that data to ensure that they use the right inputs to make sure that they're getting the outputs that they desire. And particularly as it relates to DEI outcomes.
I think that's right. And it's interesting, the results that you all found in the study, that there were so many places, whether they're law firms or corporate departments, that were not using metrics. And I will readily admit that. In fact, I would say that if I had to guess, that actually law departments are doing a worse job of using metrics for accountability on the DEI front than even law firms are. There are many law firms that I think have begun to get better, perhaps because we in law departments are pushing, perhaps, and perhaps as many other reasons, right? But I think law firms have actually advanced that more than law departments have. And it is surprising because we say all the time about our internal partners, our internal clients, right? Our clients at a company are the business people who will tell you all day, every day, if you don't measure it, it doesn't matter. And so how is it possible that we haven't figured that out? The secret sauce, what are the metrics and how can we measure them? And how can we feel good about that to hold people accountable for DEI results?
It's very interesting because I am a trial lawyer by trade, and for a profession that's so hooked into the value of facts, we just don't have a lot of facts in our own workplaces about things that we say matter. And it's not that hard to do. And you're making a very good point, Karen. I don't know, in any given location, whether law departments are worse than corporate law firms or than law firms. But it is true that there is a kind of don't show me the data mentality that takes over the longer people are in the profession, at least takes over about themselves.
And I think it's really important for legal organizations with respect to DEI, what are their goals? I mean, first you have to decide what it is that you want to measure. Do you want to measure implicit bias training? Opportunities? Do you want to measure opportunities to introduce and ensure that women and lawyers of color are getting leadership opportunities? So you need to identify what it is that's a priority, and then to set the metrics in an accountability tool to assess whether or not it's working. Karen, we Stephanie and I are data geeks, so we're always like, we could not believe this finding that people, that law firms and in-house legal departments weren't using metrics with accountability tools, because how can you measure whether they're successful unless there's some kind of metric? And compensation audits are also really important to ensure where are the pay disparities. And I think it's going to be important coming out of the pandemic to see who's been impacted, who got the bonuses, who didn't get the bonuses, especially when women and women with young children were really, under the pressure of homeschooling and childcare and elder care. And in fact, in our study, we found that generally men got the home office and women got the kitchen table to work. So of course they were disrupted more.
And I think there was a great point that was raised by Larry Felser in the chat. How are these considerations being addressed in public interest, public sector positions as well? And what are those considerations, and how are those metrics being measured?
Let me say that we did not in this report do a pullout for government or NGOs or other organizations that were not either firms or corporations. We do have general ABA data, but we didn't do a pullout for that. I anticipate that the same dynamics will come into play, the same issues about who's working here, what are the opportunities to advance, what kind of culture is this? Is it a culture that values me individually, values my contribution, will help me advance? So there is a possibility of doing those separate analyses, but it wasn't done for this report. But as I said, I think the dynamics will be the same.
Great. So we talked earlier about sort of the Zoom life and how, you would think that when everybody is in an equal sized box, that the ability to be heard would be equalized among participants in a meeting. However, your findings were that they weren't. And how does that impact DEI efforts and practices for moving forward? And how can we implement practices that will help equalize being seen?
I think Bobby and Stephanie were at the lead of this way, way, way back. We have to affirm each other. I mean, it is just, I was shaking my head as I heard you say that. I thought, how could we still be in that situation in 2021? And yet we are. And I think that falls to us to remedy. It's a long slog, but I think Bobby and Stephanie early on talked about supporting other people, affirming other people, speaking up and making sure that we are the ones that said, as somebody else said, wisely, prudently, whatever, because the fact that we are still in that world is heartbreaking, but it's a slow process, but I think we can help. And I'm gonna just say this, guys. I had a hard stop at 5 o'clock, and I'm about 10 minutes over. So I'm gonna probably be the first person to sign off of this. It's been really wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna hang for another minute or two, but then I'm gonna go away and go to my 5 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.
You.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for your input.
Joanne, wonderful. Thank you.
We so appreciate your participation today, Provost Epson, and it's really been a valuable contribution to the discussion. So we thank you for your time and for making yourself available and for staying a little bit extra. And so I'll ask whether, I don't know, Karen, if you look like you maybe wanted to add to the discussion about the Zoom boxes.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things about it. It is a fascinating sort of social study. I think, we were talking before about being thoughtful and raising your voice where you need to. And I think in what Joanne was just describing is, in those calls, even if you're not leading the call, I think often who gets to speak or who has the floor or who doesn't get spoken over or who does get spoken over depends in large part on the person who's leading the call, right? Because if that person is emotionally focused on the boxes and is watching, that's the benefit of the boxes. When we were on conference calls, we didn't have that. You didn't know if somebody wanted to speak or didn't. And with the boxes, okay, that's an upside, but it's only an upside if the leader is paying attention or if others are paying attention. So I think what I would say in reaction to what Joanne shared is, right, it's your job, even if you're not leading that call, if you see that somebody was trying to say something or that somebody got spoken over, is to say, oh, I think Julie wanted to say something, right? So it's really to try and use, and especially for those of us who are in positions of power, relative power in any particular forum, to use those positions to support others and make sure that people's voices are heard. But I am so curious as to how we will deal with the so-called leveled playing field that we have today, because everybody's on Zoom, and what we will have going forward. For us as a company, we already had what we call a distributed workforce. We already had people in lots of different locations. So on almost any call of magnitude of with more than a handful of people, you probably had some people who were physically together and some people who weren't. When we go forward, are we just going to make everybody get back on their laptops so that we have a level playing field again? Or will we go back to the opportunity to be physically present with whoever we can be physically present with in a conference room? And will that change the dynamics of inclusion? Because no matter what, we've not been able to replicate the before the meeting or the after the meeting. It's something that I say in so many different places, but that piece where you build relationships, where you make connections, where you have the happenstance conversation with somebody who you wouldn't otherwise have had a conversation with, we haven't been able to replicate that in this environment. And that's where a lot of the inclusion happens. And a lot of the exclusion happens for people who aren't in those spaces. So I think for me, that's the thing to watch about the Zoom culture.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's going to be even harder because there is going to be this hybrid of remote working. And again, so metrics are important, right? Who's taking the remote? Who is not participating in this meeting? Who's not having the opportunity for these discussions before and afterwards? And how do we make sure that there's some type of forum where we can ensure that they do have these opportunities to connect with individuals? I think one part of Zoom that has been very good is that I think it allowed people to see sort of a window into individuals' personal lives. And that for many lawyers who are really siloed in their offices, who didn't know anything about many of their partners and associates who work with them, whether their kid popped into a Zoom or a pet popped in, it really opened an opportunity to build those types of connections that I'm not sure we had before. And the last point I want to make is that we do know that, for example, senior associates really like the opportunity to connect with clients over Zoom. And I'd like your assessment on this, Karen, because in a big conference room, generally, they're at the end of the table. They weren't really allowed to participate. But on Zoom, they were a square. When they spoke, their square lit up, and they were actually able to have these interactions with clients and provide value. And I think that that's also, I think we have to learn what were the good things that came out of the pandemic that we want to implement and institute going forward.
Absolutely right. And I would only say that it's also an indicator. It's so fascinating to watch when you're in a meeting like that, to see how that that differential in power dynamic shows up. So we do, as many on this phone will know, right? Law department, and certainly as the general counsel, we have meetings with law firms where, whether it's what we used to call a beauty contest or it's just to get to know you better. And when you have, it's so fascinating to see when you have a group of people from a law firm and a group of people from the law department, how the introductions go, and who, and as well as who is making sure that those people who would have been at the end of the conference room table, actually do have a moment to introduce themselves and to take sort of ownership and pride in their role in whatever the conversation may be. And then the others, those places where you see that those folks are not valued or are not highlighted, then I think that sort of tells you something different. But you're absolutely right. I think there's been a lot more opportunity to include because of this dynamic.
And I think the excellent point that Bobby made is that not only is there an opportunity for inclusion, but there's an opportunity to also get a window into who these people are, who you're hiring, by seeing them in their personal spaces. And you know, I think I remember pre-pandemic, there was a news story about somebody who was giving a news report, and you could see the toddler in the background, and the spouse was crawling in, trying not to be seen in the shot. And you know, I think that's become normalized now, where we're used to people appearing as cats on the screen in some respects. So I think that has a humanizing effect as well. And so I'm wondering how you think that will affect these relationships moving forward between in-house counsels and law firms, and whether or not that will continue to impact how decisions are made, and whether that helps to improve from a DEI and perspective as far as how things are measured and how decisions are made as far as hiring.
So
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I think that we certainly have a more relaxed view of how we look at each other. I mean, I'm sitting here without the proverbial suit that I wore every single day until the pandemic. I've had my dog on Zoom calls because she likes to be part of the action. And, you know, there are people, this is my basement, so you can see that. But when all is said and done and the world opens up, I still believe that all of what happens in a workplace gets back to the leadership. And how engaged will the leadership be in making sure certain values are implemented, in making sure leadership is accountable, making sure leadership is transparent. So I think we have yet to see in any given workplace how it will really play out.
So we talked a little bit about how experienced lawyers are have been leaving the workforce prematurely. Do we think that, and I think we talked a little bit about this, but if you can expand, Stephanie and Bobby, about how the inability of law firms and legal departments to adapt to remote work structures, how that could lead to an exodus of millennials and younger lawyers from the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to have an impact on the generation of people who have a somewhat different view than baby boomers of whether it's about money, about engagement with their friends, about how they want to spend their lives 24/7 or in other ways. And if you take a long-term view, and by that I mean even 5 years of who's going to be in your firm and will they stay or will they go, I think you have to take account of, and again, you can ask, it's not that hard. You can ask people, how do they want to work? What kind of workplace would they like? And I think in order to keep up with really the demographic changes in this country, anyone who operates a firm or a business has to take account of those factors.
I mean, I think our study demonstrates that the 5-day work in the office model, I think is really is on its way out. I mean, most of our respondents wanted the flexibility to choose when they came into the office. They wanted at least 1 to 2 days remotely. And I think you're already seeing it. If you look at the legal media reports, you're seeing law firms recruit other associates and other talent based on the fact that they are going to offer them remote work with opportunities for development and some opportunities for FaceTime. But for the most part, they're going to be remote. And I think it's going to be a huge, as I said before, advantage to those law firms that actually model hybrid work, who actually support it. There was another report about certain law firms saying, yes, we're going to offer hybrid, but we strongly encourage you to come into the office. And that mixed message sends a signal that there will be a career cost if you don't come in. And again, I think what Stephanie and I are going to be researching and examining is, what is the gender divide? What is this impact on lawyers of color in terms of wanting to work remotely? And will it again go back to being sort of a stigmatized type of policy, like unlimited vacation, or even parental leave, which only women take and fewer men take, and certainly don't take as long as women. And those are the things to watch going forward, because I actually agree with Stephanie that millennial lawyers are going to be looking for different things. And I think during the pandemic, people actually sat back and evaluated what it is that they wanted. What were their values? How did they want to work? Where do they want to work? Who do they want to work with? And I think that that's going to have a big impact on where talent goes.
So I think Karen raised the point earlier about how what we do here in the legal profession impacts the world around us, because we're a pipeline to so many other areas and professions. So outside of the legal community, how can we use this work and this study and the solutions that we've discussed to apply outside the legal community, and what lessons can we export to other industries? I know that the ABA passed some resolutions at the mid-year meeting, which urged Congress to pass funding for childcare and for wellness resources. And so how are those efforts coming, and how can we support those efforts?
Well, I echo what Karen said at the beginning, which is we all need to be involved, because what this pandemic showed was not having affordable, available childcare resulted in the largest she-cession that we've seen in many, many years. And for many women, without having the types of affordable, available childcare, they cannot go to work. There was a recent column that showed the United States is second from the last out of 35 industrial countries, following Bulgaria and Chile, in terms of the types of support we give for families. And we need to mobilize, and as Karen said, use our voices with our Congress people, our senators, and to demand the type of infrastructure that's actually part of the Biden plan. Parental leave is part of this infrastructure plan, and we need to be mobilizing the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Bar Associations. I hope will pass resolutions similar to the ABA resolution so that we can lobby around these types of issues.
Stephanie or Karen, do you have anything? Karen, you look like you want to add.
Only to add that I think if we don't do that, Bobby, if we don't get to that place, then when we go back, when we go forward, when we land wherever we're going to land in terms of the future way of working, I could envision an environment where it continues to be the case that the people who need the greatest flexibility are the child care givers and the elder care givers that tend to be more the women and more women of color than men, and we could end up in exactly the same place as we were before the pandemic, where I'm not as committed. It appears as though you're not as committed, you're not as present, you don't make the same contacts, you don't build the same networks, you don't build relationships in the same way. And so I think we have to be vigilant about that focus. And there's so many areas that the study highlighted that we need to be focused on. But I think that one is a really important one. And it's one that it feels like we can truly, each one of us, have a role to play in it and have a very technical way that we can go forward. It's very clear steps that we can use to advance that need.
Well, I think we are nearing the end of our time, so I'm going to turn it over and ask each of our panelists to just give a 1 or 2 minute, just a few final thoughts as to what we should be doing in our own practices and in our bar associations to move these solutions that we've discussed forward. So I'll start with Stephanie, and then we'll just go around.
Okay, well, thank you very much. My advice is not about the one thing that you can do. It's not about, what must get done so much as whatever you can make change work. And I think it's up to every employer to look ahead. I said it earlier, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, to look ahead and see who do we want to have in here at work? What diversity do we want? What types of practices do we want? What types of people can we support, and how do we do that? And I just don't think it's hard to find out answers to that question. It may be hard to develop the will to even take one step and move forward. Try one type of best practice and move forward. But I do believe that once you start, it gets to be like the snowball rolling down the hill, and it will work out pretty well. But I do think that it's very important for leaders to lead and not be afraid to find out from the people who work with them what can be done, what should be done, and how can this be an even more successful place to work, a more successful business.
Thank you, Stephanie. Bobby?
I think we really need to continue to focus on wellness. And as I said before, destigmatizing, talking about these issues. I think for many people, we are not out of the woods. I think people still are sort of operating on fumes in terms of this 24/7 work schedule that has been really one that we've been doing for the past 15 months. We need to ensure that there are guidelines around, what types of communications do you have to respond to an email in the middle of the night that you get? And a lot of firms implemented those during the pandemic. And I think, again, we need to ensure that these types of sort of guardrails are put into place. The mental well-being and the stress, depression, anxiety that lawyers felt before the pandemic has really been exacerbated, and we really need to be focusing on that. Interestingly, there's a burnout index for doctors. It's called the Maslach index, but there has never actually been an index that looks at lawyers who have the same high levels of depression and anxiety and burnout that doctors have. And that's another project that Stephanie and I hope to embark on.
Thank you, Bobby. And we'll give the last word to Karen.
Oh, you should not give the last word to me. Those ladies deserve it by far. But so then I will only add that the one area that we didn't spend a whole lot of time specifically focusing on today, but that the slides were so stark on this front, is people of color in our profession. If we didn't have alarm bells before the pandemic, we certainly better now. And we need to do not just help everybody hold the line, but we've got to make fundamental and intentional changes in the way in which we are including people in our profession and in the way in which we're taking care of people. Because clearly there is, beyond the layers of mental health issues for the legal profession generally, beyond the layers of issues that have been created by the pandemic, beyond the layers of, if you are a woman, it's the intersectionality piece too. If you are a person of color and you have that whole, I think it was 50%, almost 50%, that the stress level is there solely because of that position that you occupy, and you add all of those other things on top, I can only imagine what that burden feels like all day, every day. So my last word, my ask would be, and this is of myself as well, is what can we be doing materially differently to make this a better profession for people?
Thank you all. And Bobby and Stephanie, thank you so much for your really groundbreaking and illuminating work, for continuing to bring these issues to light. Thank you to Karen and to Provost Epps for really adding some insightful commentary and some really key points to help us move forward. And a special thank you to the Philadelphia Bar Association for continuing to spotlight these and shine a spotlight on these important issues and bring these to the forefront so that we can have these really critical discussions. Thank you, everyone. And it was an honor to be a part of this. And with that, I will turn the microphone back over to Chancellor Lauren McKenna.
Thanks, Jen. And Tracy, I'm going to ask you to allow my camera to come back on so I can see folks face to face. I'd appreciate
That's my
that.
apologies.
Yep. Hopefully you can hear me. Just wanted to thank you all for such a wonderful, powerful program today. I was really encouraged and happy about all of this happening, and I'm so thankful that it did. And I want to thank you for all of the hard work that was done in connection with the report. And I also wanted to thank our moderator, Jen Coatsworth, Bobby, Stephanie, Joanne, and Karen for being here with us today. So thank you all. I'm back on the screen now. Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate you all being in attendance, and I look forward to continuing this really important conversation. Take care and have a good night, everyone.